Thanks for tuning in. My name is Rob Fletcher, and I'm a professor at the University of Florida. And for this video, I want to talk about a framework that my colleagues and I have been developing for connectivity that scales movement and gene flow to landscape conservation. So, connectivity modeling has developed rapidly over the past 15 to 20 years, and currently most approaches for connectivity modeling, and particularly the mapping of connectivity across landscapes, rely on this concept of resistance. And resistance can be thought of as the degree to which a location in the landscape potentially impedes movement of organisms or other ecological processes. Now, with resistance-based maps like the one shown here, there's been a variety of algorithms applied to map potential paths or corridors across a landscape and to interpret effective isolation. These algorithms range from the use of least cost paths to the use of circuit theory. And we've been interested in this problem, and in particular, in understanding better how resistance can impede movement, because landscapes can impede movement in two fundamentally different ways. The first is by altering movement behavior in the potential path of an organism or a process, such as the flow of water across a landscape, but they can also influence mortality risk, or essentially the failure of movement to occur across a landscape. And so we're very much interested in understanding the relative roles that these two very different issues play for connectivity mapping and the applications of connectivity to conservation. And so we want to ask the overarching question of if we can isolate the roles of resistance to movement or the impact of the landscape on movement behavior and flow relative to mortality risk, can this help us improve connectivity conservation? And so to address this issue, we've developed a framework that we affectionately title a unified framework, and I'll explain why in a moment. And this framework is called a spatial absorbing Markov chain model. And that's a bit of a mouthful, but the reason why we use that term is that this model really has emerged from classic Markov chain theory used in probability theory. And so the idea here is that at any location, if an organism is dispersing across the landscape at any point in time, there's three things that can happen. Either the organism can survive and just stay in the same place, that's fidelity. It can survive and move locally, and the distance at which it may move is going to be contingent on the time step or time scale of interest. Or it could suffer mortality. And these three things are very different. We can summarize these three things, which ultimately, in a probabilistic sense, should sum to one. And we can do this with this matrix shown here. And this matrix is composed of two very different parts. The first part is a transition matrix. We'll refer to this transition matrix as Q. And this transition matrix reflects the transient states of movement or fidelity. And then the other part of this matrix is referred to as an absorption state, which can refer to mortality or other events that would halt dispersal or movement across a landscape. And when once we've developed and parameterized this probability matrix, we can use random walk theory to then derive connectivity parameters, which I'll show in a moment. So why is this framework helpful? Well, I would argue it's helpful for at least 6 reasons. The first of which is because it is time explicit, we can predict time-specific movements and connectivity. And this is very relevant for modeling scenarios such as effects of climate change over a given time interval, or looking at problems of dynamic connectivity. We can also use this framework to not only have time-specific predictions, but long-term predictions as well, or asymptotic predictions. We can incorporate propagule pressure to capture and adjust the amount of flow or movement across a landscape, which is really important when we think about variation in species distribution or source sink dynamics, etc. Because we're modeling mortality, demographic effects can be mapped and modeled across a landscape. And because of these aforementioned issues, it really can potentially expand the scope of problems that connectivity modeling can tackle directly. And I'll show examples of this in a moment. And then finally, I would argue that it provides a means for more seamless integration of empirical data. So what I'd like to do is provide sort of 4 examples or 4 thoughts about how we can apply and use this spatial absorbing Markov chain model. And the first I want to discuss is how this modeling framework can be quite helpful for relating connectivity models to empirical data. So when we set up this framework initially, we wanted to make it as simple as possible, and in doing so, you can apply this framework simply with a resistance-based map and a second map on potential mortality risk or absorption. But more broadly, this framework works quite well with empirical data. So for example, the transition matrix Q relates directly to resource selection functions that are used frequently with telemetry data with wildlife, and in particular, step selection functions, which are commonly used with recent advances in GPS telemetry. And we can think about this in the sense that this Q matrix, which is a transient matrix of movement, these probabilities can be parameterized with a step selection function, particularly in the case when mortality risk per time step is low. We've also recently derived metrics from this framework that are directly related to population differentiation, and in particular FST. So the graph here is showing some simulations where we're looking at FST as a function of conditional first passage time, which is a metric we can derive from the spatial absorbing Markov chain. So in general, this framework, because it's time explicit and because it's probabilistic, it can be related to empirical data in ways that prior frameworks have more difficulty. We've also validated this framework. So this is an example with an experimental model landscapes undergoing habitat destruction or habitat loss. In this case, we are looking at an insect herbivore, Calenidia vitiger, the cactus bug, and we were manipulating its habitat, a Puntia cactus, across several landscapes. And the figure at the bottom shows an example of 5 of these landscapes, 15 total, where we were manipulating and removing cactus habitat for this specialist herbivore. And when we did this, we could use mark recapture to quantify movements under habitat loss across landscapes. And we applied this framework relative to least cost paths and circuit theory. And when we did so, there was overwhelming support for the absorbing Markov chain to explain observed movement across this landscape. And the fundamental reason for this is that the matrix surrounding these habitat patches of a Puntia cactus can have very different effects on movement behavior of this insect relative to mortality risk. And so it was the incorporation of mortality risk directly into this model that helped improve model fit considerably. We've also applied this framework to look at road mortality risk for the endangered Florida panther and its potential dispersal north in Florida, which is a necessary criterion for delisting of this species. Andrew Marx illustrated this while also illustrating the SAMC package for R that we've developed for applying this framework. And so what he did is he used a prior information on landscape resistance from telemetry data and information on where Florida panthers have suffered mortality over the years. And he coupled these 2 sets of information to map the probability of movement from 2 key source locations in South Florida and the likelihood that these dispersing panthers would suffer mortality across the landscape. Ultimately, these maps were highly correlated, but as you can see on the right, the probability of mortality really increased substantially near roads due to vehicle mortality. Finally, we've applied this framework to human-elephant conflict in Southwest India, where Divya Vasudev and colleagues have used the SAMC to predict human-wildlife conflict, where they took information from surveys around protected areas to populate resistance and conflict maps shown here. And then they validated the model using media reports of elephant conflict from newspapers. And in this case, this is just showing one output that's mapping the potential human-wildlife conflict that is predicted to occur when elephants disperse out of 5 key protected areas in Southwest India. Importantly, when we validated this predicted map, the observed conflict areas in our validation data had predictions for conflict risk that were 4.3 times higher than the background or the average. And so ultimately this modeling framework was able to capture to at least some degree the observed conflict across this landscape. So ultimately, we would argue that this framework can be quite helpful for interpreting movement relative to mortality for connectivity applications. And the spatial absorbing Markov chain is a really generalizable framework to approach this type of problem. And ultimately, other frameworks such as circuit theory can be considered a special case of the absorbing Markov chain. Finally, we're refining this framework in a variety of ways, such as extending it to the use of correlated random walks instead of simple random walks, and scaling this framework to be applied to larger landscapes than we've currently applied them to, which have been on the order of 2 to 5 million cells in these landscapes. So thank you for tuning in. I just want to thank our funding and support. And if you have any questions, please contact me and I would love to discuss.